hooves strike dry earth somewhere behind a lone traveler on a mountain path in ancient Thessaly, closer with every heartbeat, and there is no way yet to tell whether what is chasing him runs on 2 legs or 4. That single, unresolved sound, half animal and half something disturbingly human, sat at the root of one of the most misunderstood creatures in all of Greek mythology. The centaur most people carry in their heads today is a noble guardian pulled straight out of children's books and fantasy worlds, the wise archer who trains the hero or leads him safely through an enchanted forest. In the world of Narnia and across the universe of Harry Potter, centaurs appear as calm, disciplined beings, almost teachers of moral restraint rather than monsters. And that image has been repeated so often across films, games, and illustrated books that most viewers never think to question it, treating the centaur as a settled, familiar archetype rather than the product of a long and genuinely troubled mythological history. But once you step back into the original Greek sources, that picture changes almost beyond recognition. And the old cliche about the truth being darker than the legend turns out to be true in the most literal sense. A centaur was traditionally shown with the torso of a man and the body of a horse, and in nearly every case that horse body belonged to a stallion, though exceptions did exist. Female centaurs were called centaurides, and they appear far less often in myth than their male counterparts. The most famous among them was Hylanome, a centauride so devoted to her husband Silurus that after he died in battle, she took her own life with his own spear, choosing to follow him into the afterlife rather than live without him. In the oldest surviving stories, centaurs were never gentle helpers. They were violent, unpredictable creatures who attacked travelers and terrorized entire communities living near their territory. And their reputation for savagery was so consistent across different regions of Greece that it clearly reflected something the audience already expected to hear, not a surprising twist invented by a single storyteller. Many scholars read this duality as deliberate symbolism, with the human torso standing for reason and order, while the horse body represents raw instinct, excess, and an inability to control desire. It is a strikingly literal piece of visual philosophy, a body built to argue that civilization and animal appetite live inside the same creature and are always fighting for control of it. Not every centaur fit that violent mold, and the tension between the wild majority and the rare, disciplined exception is exactly what gives this mythology its lasting power. A tension we will spend the rest of this video unpacking piece by piece. The word centaur itself comes from Greek, yet hybrid figures combining a human upper body with an animal lower body appear in art long before Greece became the cultural center we imagine today, and that fact alone raises an uncomfortable question. Where did this image actually come from, and why did so many unrelated cultures, separated by centuries and by entire seas, keep returning to the same unsettling idea of a man fused with a horse? Before we can answer that, it helps to understand just how differently the earliest Greeks themselves pictured this creature, because the tidy human torso on horse body design, familiar from later vase paintings, was not fixed from the very beginning. Early artists experimented, sometimes giving centaurs a complete human body with only a horse's rear end and tail attached from behind, and it took generations of trial and error before the more familiar four-legged hybrid form became the standard. That slow, uncertain process of settling on a single image is itself a clue that centaurs were not simply copied from one finished template, but were built up gradually out of older ideas, reshaped every time a new artist or storyteller picked up the theme. Even the word centaur carries its own unresolved mystery. Its exact origin is not fully settled among linguists, though one long-standing hypothesis connects it to an old Greek root meaning to pierce or to spear, tying the name to bull-spearing horsemen who once hunted cattle across the plains of Thessaly, the very region later mythology treats as the centaur's homeland. If that reading is correct, then the name itself may have started out describing skilled human riders and only later drifted onto the half-horse creatures who supposedly lived in the same mountains, which would mean the myth and the mundane reality of Thessalian horsemanship were tangled together from the very start rather than existing as two separate stories that happened to collide. Long before the centaur became a Greek symbol, a strikingly similar figure already existed in the Near East, and this part of the story rarely makes it into popular retellings. During the second millennium before our era, a people called the Kassites ruled over Babylonia after arriving from the Zagros Mountains, and they held that power for roughly 4 centuries. The Kassite kings left behind neither grand palaces nor famous libraries as their most distinctive legacy, but a very particular kind of monument known as a kudurru, a carved boundary stone that recorded royal grants of land to favored subjects. Picture one of these stones standing alone in the dim interior of a Babylonian temple, taller than a person. Its surface covered edge to edge with carved rows of gods and symbols meant to be read by divine eyes as much as human ones. These stones were kept inside temples, not so that ordinary people could read them, but so that the gods themselves would witness the agreement and enforce it, while a clay copy of the same text was handed to the actual landowner for everyday use. Carved into the upper portion of a kudurru were rows of divine symbols, arranged according to the rank of each god in the heavenly hierarchy, and among those symbols, a strange figure sometimes appears that is very difficult to call anything other than a centaur. One of the best documented examples belonged to a king named Meli-Shipak, who reigned during the 12th century before our era. And among the divine symbols carved onto his boundary stone stands a 2-headed, 2-tailed winged creature with a human upper body drawing a bow, a figure that modern scholars describe as an early forerunner of the constellation Sagittarius. This was not a decorative afterthought placed carelessly on the margins of a legal document. It was part of the formal religious apparatus meant to protect the contract and warn away anyone tempted to violate the boundary or damage the stone, sitting alongside symbols of storm gods, war gods, and household deities in a carefully organized visual hierarchy. The Kassites were not working in a vacuum either. Composite. Hybrid creatures had already been part of Mesopotamian religious art for well over 1,000 years by that point. From scorpion-bodied guardians to lion-headed spirits, and the archer centaur on Meli-Shipak's boundary stone fits naturally into that much older regional habit of using hybrid bodies to represent forces too powerful or too strange to depict as ordinary humans or animals. The Kassites had nothing to do with the Greek gods who would later populate Mount Olympus, yet the idea of a hybrid being, half human and half animal, armed and alert, spread along trade routes and cultural contacts across the eastern Mediterranean long before a comparable figure ever appeared in Greek art. Some historians propose that Mycenaean contact with Mesopotamia and Anatolia may have carried this concept westward into the Aegean world, since Bronze Age Greece was already trading pottery, metals, and ideas with the wider Near East through intermediaries in Cyprus and the Levant, though no one can trace a direct, unbroken line of transmission. And this remains an informed hypothesis rather than an established fact. What can be stated with real confidence is that separate cultures, distant from one another in both geography and language, independently arrived at a remarkably similar image, a being that fuses human intellect with animal power, and that convergence alone says something about how deeply this idea sits inside the human imagination. When Greek artists eventually began carving their own centaurs, they were not inventing the concept from nothing. They were working within an artistic tradition whose roots reached back into a much older world, one where the boundary between human and animal had already been treated as something worth blurring on purpose. The oldest known centaur in Greek art is not a painting on a vase or a relief on a temple wall, but a small, deliberately broken clay figurine discovered on the island of Euboea, near a settlement called Lefkandi. Excavated by archaeologists from the British School at Athens in the late 1960s, the Lefkandi centaur dates to roughly the 10th century before our era, a period so early that Greek mythology, as later generations understood, it had not even been written down yet, since Homer's epics would not be recorded for another 2 centuries. This was the tail end of what historians once called the Greek Dark Age, the long, quiet stretch of roughly 3 centuries that followed the sudden collapse of Mycenaean palace civilization around the year 1200 before our era, a period when monumental architecture, writing, and large-scale art had all but disappeared, leaving pottery as almost the only continuous thread of evidence. The figurine was found split into two separate pieces, buried in two adjoining graves several meters apart, with the head placed among the offerings in one tomb and the body left in the other, and archaeologists still debate exactly why it was deliberately broken before burial. One influential theory connects the practice to the wider tradition of intentionally damaging valuable objects before laying them to rest with the dead, a custom seen elsewhere in early Iron Age burial practices, where swords were sometimes bent and treasured items ritually destroyed as part of the funeral itself. What makes this particular object so significant is a small but telling detail: a visible gash carved into the left knee of the figure. Some scholars argue that this wound is a direct visual reference to the story of Chiron, the wise centaur who was later said to have been struck by one of Heracles' poisoned arrows in the knee, a wound so agonizing that even his immortality could not spare him from suffering. If that identification is correct, then the Lefkandi centaur may be the earliest surviving evidence that the story of Chiron, healer, teacher, and reluctant victim of his own students' carelessness, already existed in some form centuries before it was ever written down, since the Iliad itself, composed generations later, already refers to Chiron twice by name specifically as a skilled healer and as the teacher who raised Achilles. Other researchers remain more cautious, pointing out that without written sources from this exact period, no one can be completely certain the sculptor intended to depict Chiron specifically rather than a more generic hybrid figure. Since Greek mythology at that early stage was still an oral, shifting tradition rather than a fixed body of canon. What is not in dispute is the object's importance. Standing roughly 36 centimeters tall and shaped by a skilled potter during the final stretch of the Dark Age, the Lefkandi centaur is widely regarded as the first true masterpiece of early Greek sculpture. And it marks the moment when Greek artists began reaching for images powerful enough to carry the weight of a story rather than simply decorating a surface. Once Greek culture entered its artistic revival from around the 9th and 8th centuries before our era onward, centaurs multiplied rapidly across bronze figurines, painted vases, and small terracotta offerings. Though the design was still far from settled, some pieces from this period show a centaur with 4 full horse legs and no human legs at all, while others show a complete human body with only a horse's hindquarters and tail attached behind, an awkward, half-finished version of the creature that later artists would eventually abandon in favor of the familiar 4-legged form most people recognize today. The cemetery where the Lefkandi centaur was buried, known today as Tomba, was clearly reserved for people of unusual status even in this impoverished, post-collapse era. Nearby, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an enormous building, sometimes described as an early heroon or memorial hall, far larger than anything else known from Greece at that time, along with rich grave goods including imported gold and bronze objects that had traveled long distances to reach this small settlement on Euboea. That context matters because it tells us the broken centaur figurine was not a cheap toy or a mass-produced trinket, but a valuable object chosen deliberately for burial alongside people whose community still had access to real wealth and long-distance trade, even while most of Greece was living through centuries of comparative poverty and isolation. Whoever placed that figurine in the ground, split it in two, and separated the pieces between neighboring graves was performing a ritual act important enough to warrant destroying a genuinely rare and valuable work of art, which only deepens the mystery of what the centaur meant to the people who buried it, to understand where the entire race of centaurs supposedly came from. Greek tradition points back to one of the most disturbing stories in the whole mythological catalog, first recorded by the poet Pindar in the early 5th century before our era. At the center of it stands Ixion, a king of the Lapids in Thessaly, a man who broke nearly every rule that hospitality demanded of a guest, and in ancient Greece that was never treated as a small offense, since the bond between host and guest was considered sacred and personally guarded by Zeus himself. Ixion owed a bride price to his father-in-law for the right to marry his daughter, and rather than pay what he owed, he made excuse after excuse until his father-in-law grew tired of waiting and simply seized several of Ixion's prized horses instead. Ixion responded by inviting the older man to a feast, and once his guest arrived, he threw him into a pit of burning coals, an act of such extreme treachery that it violated every possible rule of kinship and hospitality at once, and it drove Ixion mad and cost him his own kingdom. Every neighboring ruler refused to forgive or purify him for the crime, until, surprisingly, Zeus himself showed mercy, inviting the disgraced king up to Mount Olympus and seating him among the gods as an honored guest. Ixion repaid that kindness by becoming obsessed with Hera, the wife of Zeus, and Zeus, realizing what his guest intended, chose not to strike him down immediately, but instead shaped a cloud into an exact likeness of Hera and named her Nephili, a name that simply means cloud in Greek. Blinded by desire, Ixion believed he had succeeded in seducing the goddess herself, when in truth he had only sealed his own punishment, later bound eternally to a spinning wheel of fire flung across the sky, a fate so severe that later Greek writers treated Ixion as the ultimate example of a guest who betrayed his host beyond any hope of forgiveness. From his union with the cloud came a child, and different versions of the myth disagree on exactly what that child was, with some claiming Nephila gave birth directly to the first horse-human hybrid, while others say she bore a man named Centaurs, who grew violent and uncontrollable, was rejected by the human world around him, fled into the mountains of Thessaly, and there mated with wild mares roaming a region known as Magnesia, producing the entire savage race of centaurs from that unnatural union. Either version of the story lands in the same place. These centaurs inherited nothing gentle from their origin, only the shame of a father who violated hospitality, the isolation of a son rejected by his own kind, and an upbringing spent entirely among wild animals rather than civilized people. It is worth pausing here to clear up a separate point of confusion that trips up even careful viewers, because Chiron's own parentage involves a different figure entirely, unconnected to Ixion's line. Chiron was said to be the son of the nymph Philyra and the titan Kronos, the father of Zeus and ruler of the previous divine generation, and Kronos should never be confused with Kronos, an entirely separate personification of time itself that belongs to a different strand of Greek philosophical thought rather than to this particular family of myths. Keeping these two similarly named figures apart matters, because mixing them up is one of the most common mistakes people make when discussing this exact subject, and it is worth remembering that Chiron descends from a completely different older lineage than the wild centaurs born from Ixion's disgrace, which is a large part of why his story turns out so differently from theirs. Read as a whole, the Ixion story functions less like a simple monster origin tale and more like a moral warning built directly into the landscape of Thessaly itself. Every element of the crime, the unpaid debt, the murder of a guest, the attempted seduction of a god's wife, the failed deception by way of a false cloud bride, stacks one violation of trust on top of another. And the centaurs who result from it inherit that entire chain of betrayal rather than any single trait. Ancient audiences hearing this story were not simply being told that centaurs happen to be violent. They were being shown, step by step, exactly how a lineage curdles when it begins with dishonored hospitality, which is precisely the value ancient Greek households depended on most heavily whenever a stranger arrived at their door. Centaur mythology essentially splits into two opposing portraits, and nothing illustrates that split better than a single notorious wedding. When Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, married Hippodamia, the centaurs attended as neighbors and, in some tellings, distant kin, and the celebration began peacefully enough with music, food, and plenty of wine. That last detail turned out to be the problem. Once the wine took hold, the centaurs lost every trace of restraint. And what started as harmless drunkenness quickly escalated into an attempt to carry off the women at the feast, including the bride herself, whose name ironically meant she who masters horses. Led by a centaur named Eurytion, the brawl turned into open warfare between centaurs and Lapiths, a clash so central to Greek imagination that Athenian artists carved it directly into the metopes of the Parthenon itself, using the battle as a public symbol of civilization pushing back against chaos, excess, and the loss of self-control. A quieter but equally telling episode involves a centaur named Pholus, who lived apart from his violent kin in a cave in Arcadia and followed the rules of hospitality far more carefully than Ixion ever had. When Heracles passed through during his hunt for the Erymanthian boar, Pholus welcomed him and offered food, but hesitated over a particular jar of wine, since it belonged communally to all the centaurs of the region rather than to Pholus alone, and had been a gift from the god Dionysus himself. Heracles pushed him to open it anyway, and the moment the jar was unsealed, the scent of the wine carried across the mountainside, drawing the rest of the centaurs into a furious, armed confrontation with Heracles that Pholus never wanted and never started. A similarly dark thread runs through the story that eventually kills Heracles himself. While traveling with his wife Deianira, Heracles reached a river too dangerous to cross on foot, and a centaur named Nessus offered to carry her across while Heracles swam alongside. Halfway through the crossing, Nessus tried to escape with Deianira, and Heracles shot him with an arrow poisoned by the blood of the Hydra. As he lay dying, Nessus told Deianira that his own blood carried a hidden power capable of guaranteeing her husband's love forever. A lie that would later drive her to soak a robe in that same poisoned blood and offer it to Heracles, unknowingly causing him unbearable pain and ultimately his own death by fire. This exact sequence of events, from the poisoned river crossing to the burning robe, later became the subject of an entire tragedy by the playwright Sophocles, titled Women of Trachis, which stages Deianira not as a villain, but as a devoted wife manipulated by a dying centaur's final act of spite, unable to recognize the trap hidden inside his last words until it was already far too late to undo. The damage. Set against this pattern of violence and betrayal stands Chiron, the one centaur who consistently breaks the mold. Raised not among wild centaurs, but by the twins Apollo and Artemis, after his own mother abandoned him in horror at his appearance, Chiron became a healer, an astrologer, a hunter, and eventually the teacher of legendary heroes, including Jason, Achilles, and Heracles himself. His story ends in tragic irony. Wounded by accident during that same chaotic brawl, sparked by Pholus's open wine jar, struck by one of the very poisoned arrows his own former student was carrying. Because Chiron was immortal, he could not die from the wound, yet he could not stop suffering from it either, and in the end he chose to trade away his own immortality so that Prometheus could finally be released from his punishment. Zeus honored that sacrifice by placing Chiron among the stars, where he remains today as the constellation Sagittarius. A permanent reminder that not every centaur inherited the same fate. The image outlived the culture that invented it. Centuries after the Parthenon metopes were carved, Roman artists were still fascinated enough by the same creature to lay entire mosaic floors depicting centaurs, including one striking example excavated from the ruins of Hadrian's Villa outside Rome, showing the same tension between savage instinct and refined artistry that Greek sculptors had already been exploring nearly 1,000 years earlier. A single mythological image rarely survives that long by accident, and centaurs endured because they kept giving very different generations of artists a flexible way to talk about the same uncomfortable question. How much of what we call civilization is really just instinct wearing a disguise? So where did this entire idea actually come from, and why did it stay so persistent across so many centuries and so many separate cultures? Several competing theories try to answer that question, and none of them fully cancels out the others. One holds that early tribes encountering mounted riders for the first time, especially in the chaos and dust of a skirmish, genuinely struggled to tell where the rider ended and the horse began. And out of that confusion, the image of a single fused creature took shape. A theory that gains extra weight from the fact that horseback riding itself was a relatively late and unfamiliar skill in much of the ancient Mediterranean world, arriving from cultures further east and north. Another theory frames centaurs as a stand-in for foreign outsiders, particularly for groups the Greeks viewed as culturally distant or threatening, using the hybrid form as a shorthand way to mark them as fundamentally other, uncivilized, and dangerous simply by virtue of not living inside a Greek city. A third reading treats the entire centauromachy at Pirithous' wedding as a symbolic echo of real tension between horse-based, land-focused communities and settled, trade-oriented city dwellers, with the myth dramatizing a much older social conflict rather than describing anything literal that actually happened at a single wedding feast. None of these three explanations actually require the others to be wrong, and that is worth sitting with for a moment. A single myth can begin as a half-understood glimpse of a rider on horseback, get reshaped over generations into a symbol for outsiders beyond the edge of the known world, and then get reused again by a later generation of artists as commentary on entirely different social tensions closer to home, all without anyone involved feeling like they were changing the story. Myths rarely have one clean origin point the way a modern invention does. They accumulate meaning the way a river picks up sediment, carrying a little bit of every culture and every century that ever told the story forward into the next one, which is exactly why a single creature could simultaneously represent a misunderstood horseman, a feared foreigner, and a warning about unchecked appetite. All at the same time, without any of those readings canceling the others out. Even Chiron's own place in the night sky is less settled than most people assume. Long before Greek astronomers ever drew a centaur into that part of the zodiac, Babylonian skywatchers had already mapped the same stretch of sky as a figure called Pabalsag, a far stranger composite creature with wings, a scorpion's tail, and the head of a dog, functioning partly as a boundary judge and partly as a guide for the souls of the dead, a role with no equivalent in anything later attached to Chiron. When the Greeks eventually adopted this region of the sky as their own, not every ancient writer agreed that the resulting archer was a centaur at all. Some ancient astronomers argued the figure was actually a satyr named Crotus, a skilled hunter and companion of the Muses, pointing out that a second unrelated constellation called Centaurus already existed elsewhere in the sky, which made a second centaur seem redundant. That argument never fully won out, and by the time illustrated star charts became common centuries later, the centaur version had already become the standard image. But the disagreement itself is a small, perfect example of how uncertain even a supposedly fixed piece of mythology can be once you look closely enough at its history. Taken together, these theories point toward a single underlying truth. Centaurs consistently struggle to master the animal half of their own nature, all except for Chiron, who stood apart not because he was born any differently, but because he was raised differently, shaped by discipline and by two of the most orderly gods in the entire pantheon rather than left to instinct in the mountains of Thessaly. That single contrast leaves an open and genuinely uncomfortable question hanging over the entire myth. Were the rest of the centaurs simply born savage, doomed from the very moment Ixion betrayed his own father-in-law, or did an entire race inherit violence the same way a child inherits a name, through upbringing rather than blood? It is a question the ancient Greeks themselves never fully answered either, since they kept returning to centaurs again and again across temples, vases, and poetry for centuries without ever settling on a single verdict about what these creatures were actually supposed to represent. Which explanation feels closer to the truth to you, and does it change how you look at every noble? Storybook centaur you have encountered since childhood, now that you know where the image genuinely came from.